Hello everyone, welcome to this evening's conversation. My name is Meri Fatin. It's just fantastic to have you with us this evening. And also people joining us from all over the world, which is brilliant. So our guest tonight is author Polly Samson to speak about her latest work, A Theatre for Dreamers. I'm going to properly introduce you in a sec, Polly. I'm not going to just bring you into the conversation. And I just want to say thank you also to Jane Seaton from Beaufort Street Books for joining us, for organising us for this event and the previous ones that she's done, because the whole idea of this, particularly in isolation, has been about making sure that we all stay connected, that we get to hear from authors who are trying to release their new work during isolation. And also the real purpose is to make sure that you then go out, when you go out to buy your copy of A Theatre for Dreamers, that you will actually go to your local bookstore, wherever that happens to be, that's where we want you to buy your copy of the book from. Also, if you just use your mouse to just scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little Q&A box. If at any stage you want to throw in a question for me to ask Polly, just type it in there, and I'll be the only one who can see all of the questions. You'll see only your question, but you won't see everybody else's. So don't be embarrassed. Throw in a question if you'd like to. It'd be most welcome, and if I can see an opportunity, I'll definitely throw it in there. Polly, it's so great to have you with us. Now, you'd already written 2 novels and 2 collections of short stories before you embarked on A Theatre for Dreamers. And I know it was published in April and it went to #2 on the Sunday Times bestseller list straight away, which is absolutely brilliant start to its journey in life. The instant attraction with this book, I think, is the setting on the Greek island of Hydra in 1960, where for several years, a growing number of artists and writers and other creatives have come to live, and they've formed this dynamic artist colony. So the anchors of that colony are the Australian writers Charmian, Clift and George Johnston, who had lived on the island for some years up until that point. And among the island colony's famous members were Leonard Cohen, his muse Marianne Ilhen, and for a short time, he was her husband, Norwegian writer Axel Jensen. Polly, I've loved reading this book, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's morning here, but good evening, everybody. And yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be here to talk about the book.
There are a few threads that came together for you that actually started this book off. A passion for Charmian Clift's writing, the fact that you realised that one of your favourite artists in Leonard Cohen had known Charmian Clift, your acquaintance with the island of Hydra, and then also a pile of photographs. So I wondered if we could, maybe you could tell us about each of those aspects.
How it came about it started in 2014. I mean, it has been, to call it an obsession would be an understatement, I think, but it started in 2014 quite innocently with a holiday to Hydra, with no intention of writing. In fact, I had a different book that I was working on at that point. And in the house that we just went for half term with all our kids, and there were some books, and this was one of the books. And so, of course, I read it because it was set on the island. And for those who don't know, the island is tiny. It's 5 miles long, a couple of miles wide, really tiny, with one small town, because the rest of it is all mountainous and uninhabitable. So everyone is sort of thrown into this one little waterside town with houses going up the hills, no traffic. And I read this story of Charmian Clift's year on Hydra. It's her first year on Hydra. She'd been on another island before that, and she also wrote a wonderful memoir about that called Mermaid Singing. But the year on Hydra that she writes about in this book is the year that her 3rd child is born in the house. And it's just the most wonderful, wonderful book and the writer I had never heard of before. And so when I got back to London, I went, and I think the next thing I did was I found Nadia Wheatley's biography of Charmian Clift, which I couldn't recommend more highly. It is a brilliant work of biography. And that work of biography, which is deeply scholarly, was partly a corrective to an earlier biography of George Johnston, written by Gary Kinane, which is also a very good read, but presents Charmian in a rather sort of odd light. And I noticed immediately, having read the biography of George Johnston, that it really chimed very awkwardly with her own voice, and that interested me. It really interested me, the idea that a woman should have such a strange sort of thing grow up after her death that maybe presented her as someone that she possibly wasn't entirely. It was so at odds, the portrait of her, and the more research I did, the more you would find these voices who had very particular things to say about Charmian Clift. And what they didn't tend to talk about was how talented she was. Yeah. They tended to talk about the sort of very, very sort of sad later years on Hydra, just before they left, when there was drunkenness and infidelity, and all of those things, once you start looking into it, become much more complicated than those sort of bold and rather misogynist statements. And so I became really interested in her. And so after that, I tracked down more or less everything, well, in fact, everything that I could find that she'd written, the essays, which I thoroughly recommend, also the novels. And then that started me on a bit of an obsession. And I think when I'd been on Hydra in 2014, I hadn't realized, despite that I was such a huge Leonard Cohen fan, I don't think I'd realized that it was the island Leonard Cohen had a house on. And part of the reason I didn't realize that was that the Idriots themselves don't make a thing of it. And it's one of the great things about the island, that you embark, you don't hear Bird on a Wire playing in every taverna. In fact, you don't hear it at all. You just wouldn't know. And in fact, I didn't know. And so I think the next thing was some photographs online of Charmian. And there, we know these photographs now. I think we all know these photographs where Leonard is playing what is purported to be his first concert under the trees at Duskus, and Charmian is beside him, and the whole circle is sort of gathered around. And these photographs are wonderful. And at that point, I thought, well, this is really interesting, because I've never read anything about Charmian Clift and Leonard Cohen, and yet she was such an interesting woman, as was George Johnston, a really interesting man. I mean, I'm not at all denigrating him in any of these statements. And so then I got very, very interested in those photographs. And I think the next thing I found was an essay written by Tanya Dalshell and Paul Giannoni, which they had published. It was an academic essay about the photographs. And in that essay, they mentioned that there were over 1,500 of these photographs, which were taken by a wartime correspondent friend of George Johnston's called James Burke, who had been living on Athens in 1960 and had been traveling to Hydra to take photographs of this community of interesting beats and hippie, well, they weren't yet hippies because it was 1960, but people who would have gone on to be called hippies, I guess. And he had a commission with Life magazine to do a photo essay of this community. And well, this was a huge stroke of luck for anyone wanting to write about this community. It wasn't so lucky for him because, for reasons that no one seems to know, that photo essay was never published. But what Tanya and Paul's essay did for me was it sort of opened the door to the existence of these photographs. And then through a really serendipitous stroke of luck, someone I knew had access to the contact sheets and sent them to me. And it was intoxicating. I mean, it was one of those moments of research that you just can't believe that you are allowed to have such a wonderful research material, because I've just spent days and weeks, and in fact for the years that I was writing this book, just staring at these photographs, and they just prompted all sorts of knowledge about the people and about how they related to each other. And it was how they related to each other that interested me the most, because although I had by this point read, biographies of Leonard Cohen and biographies of Marianne Ilhen and Axel Jensen and everything I could lay my hands on, what I'd never read was how they really interacted. And so that was many strands of starting point down the labyrinth.
Thank you. It's a wonderful story. I love the way that all came together. And I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the photographs, because what's amazing about them is, I don't know if none of them are posed, but most of them don't seem to be posed. They're completely candid. And so it does leave it open to your interpretation, doesn't it?
Well, it really does, but also because there were so many of them. You know, if anyone who's been around a photographer, and some of these photographs, you can see that James Burke has a Leica, which is very much a sort of street photography camera. He's not having to do any setup. You know, with his Leica, he can snap away in quite intimate situations. You know, and this is indeed what you see, that they have completely forgotten the existence of a photographer because he snaps away. He's not saying, oh, you know, George, could you just stand there, Charmian, next to him? He is just in among the people, and he's doing that thing that the really great photojournalists do, of becoming more or less invisible. So you see their genuine relationships. I mean, there are things that are so delightful in those photos. I mean, there are also things that are very telling. So, for example, in the series I just mentioned, where Leonard is playing guitar, I mean, there are tens, maybe even 50, 60 of that set, and in some of them you see that Axel Jensen has picked up the guitar, and at this point this sort of crowd has dispersed and it looks like everyone's gone for a loo break. And so I looked at those, but the person who's loyally still there, kind of looking, kind of encouraging, is Marianne, who can't seem to help herself, despite that this is at the end of a period when he's treated her incredibly badly. There she is, still loyally listening as Axel kind of rather madly sort of is, you know, kind of crouched over this guitar. And I kind of, you know, would love to if only photographs had sound effects, because, you know, it would be wonderful to know what he was playing. He was quite a good musician. So I worked out that possibly he was singing something in Norwegian. You know, it's that sort of thing that's so entrancing about the photographs. And then, you know, the other thing that I spent a lot of time trying to work out was, well, what was Leonard Cohen playing? Because we know that he first played his own songs, but what was that first song? What could he just pick up a guitar at that age? You know, he was 25, he turned 26 in that first year, 1960, on the island. But what is he playing? It's so frustrating. And we know some of the things he played, like Red River Valley, things that weren't his own, but what of his own material? And because I was including that scene in the novel, I really had to know, even though I wasn't going to name any songs or write out any lyrics necessarily, but for myself, in order to put myself in that circle of people, I needed to know what he was playing. And so I went through quite a lot of the sort of early poems, and I found that there was this great sort of rousing sing-along song called Fingerprints, which it doesn't appear on an album until it appears on the Phil Spector, the very unpopular Leonard Cohen album, the one that even he himself claimed not to like, but which I love, Death of a Ladies' Man. Mm. And Fingerprints, I think that album is 1977, and Fingerprints is on that album, but it appeared in Parasites of Heaven, in, you know, in the earlier 60s as a poem. And actually, when you listen to it, you think, yeah, no, that's what he's playing. That's, to my mind, that's what he's playing in those photographs. And I don't think I can ever shake myself of that belief now.
I want to go back to how this artist colony came about in the first place, because I mean, it was really quite an unusual thing. As you say, I mean, this is before hippies. It's even like at the very beginning of the Beat generation, really. And it was late 50s when George Johnson and Charmian and Clift decided to move to Hydra. And I'm really interested to know what they thought they would get out of that move. Like, what was in it for them?
Well, they moved from another island called Kalymnos, which, as I mentioned, was the island that she wrote her previous memoir about, which was even more basic than Hydra. I mean, Hydra didn't have, you know, mains water. It didn't have mains electricity. It had very little electricity. As I've mentioned, then as now, no roads at all, no wheeled vehicles, because it's all built on hills. But what they got out of it was that it, compared to Kalymnos, it was the seat of civilization. I mean, it was a ferry ride from Athens, although in those days it was a sort of 5-hour ferry ride. Now it's an hour and a half, but then it was 5 hours. But that's still, you know, compared to everywhere else, that was quite close to civilization. It was also somewhere where artists had been before. So they weren't the first. I mean, there had been a sort of post-war and pre-war group centered around a large mansion that was then on the island, owned by a Greek painter called Nikos Gikas, who was very sociable. And, you know, it was the place where people like Paddy Lee Fermer and Cyril Connolly and Lawrence Durrell had all, in the past, written there, stayed there, You know, there are some sort of famous books that have been written in that house. And so it was quite well set up for writers. Things had been written there before, things that George and Charmian would have read and known about. But I mean, mainly what they were there for was, you know, they were poor, they wanted to write, but they wanted to be in the sunshine, they needed to be somewhere cheap. And Hydra was, yes, I guess the main thing, it was comparatively civilized compared to what they'd come from.
Was Charmian actually able to work? I mean, I know obviously she wrote Peel Me a Lotus, but I mean, this is the thing, that her life as an artist is very severely curtailed by her other responsibilities. And I mean, you've talked a little bit about the hardships of living on Hydra, but part of that would be lugging water and stuff that we just, you know, really primitive compared to what we understand now.
Yeah, when you look at the house that they bought, which is the house by the well, it's still exactly the same. I wrote part of this book in that house, which was extraordinary. But they were very, very sensible because they bought one of the few houses that wasn't up any steps. And when you think about how George Johnston's health deteriorated, he had TB undiagnosed at the beginning, diagnosed in 59. You know, he had very, very poor breathing, desperately struggling towards the end for every breath. It would have been impossible had they bought one of the houses up the hill. So they had a very rare house, which was a house with no steps. So that was a huge saving grace. Yes, it was difficult, but I don't think that George didn't do his fair share of the work, strangely. I don't think that it was that she was so loaded. I mean, she was a woman, you know, of those times. So there was an expectation that a lot of the domestic responsibilities would fall to her. But I think that she was also someone who, she really did sort of try to do everything. And I think that she took enormous pleasure from helping to facilitate George's work. And he really needed her, and she really liked being needed by him. And, you know, we have to remember that in Sydney, when they first knew each other, when she was such a young woman, he was 10 years older, but she was, you know, really she was 23, I think, when they were first together. And the first thing they did was they wrote a novel together. So, you know, and then when they moved to London, that's what they did. They collaborated. So I don't think she ever lost that need to help him. So it wasn't entirely that he was being so, you know, unreasonably demanding. I think there was a large part of her that really took joy in helping him to write his books. And I think it was also quite pragmatic because, you know, we're still in the times when a man could make more from writing than a woman. I mean, you know, it was much harder for a woman to make a living from writing. And I think, you know, the part of her that was deeply pragmatic knew that to put food on the table, he needed to have the hit because that's what was going to pay the bills. And, you know, I mean, the last year that they were living there, you know, she did genuinely, by all accounts, sit on the step next to his desk. And, you know, and while he wrote, you know, the wonderful, wonderful, you know, My Brother Jack, you know, which you have to think that a lot of that is all credit to her, you know. And I guess she felt that. So, and the other thing is that she did write 2 novels while she was there. So she wasn't completely unproductive. If you think that they were, you know, in Greece for almost a decade, well, in that time, she wrote 2 amazing memoirs and 2 novels and facilitated an enormous number of books from George, including that My Brother Jack being such a sort of classic and great book. Then I don't think she is that unproductive. She isn't what we would call unproductive. I'd be perfectly happy with 4 books in a decade of my own.
No, my question was more about with all of the other responsibilities with the 3 children, and they were incredibly sociable and people wanted to be around them, and they were really the central point of this artist colony, whether there were so many distractions, but clearly not. Clearly she was like beyond productive, really.
It was their incredible work ethic, both of them. I mean, they were, you know, because they did do a huge amount of carousing, clearly. You know, I think the children more or less brought themselves up. I mean, the children just had free reign of the island, and, you know, in every house they were welcome and they could get a meal wherever they wanted. And I think the children were quite feral. I mean, that doesn't mean that there aren't responsibilities, but yeah, I think that they just worked really hard. They didn't, you know, they worked while other people kind of lay around on the rocks moaning about their hangovers. Somehow they managed to work through their hangovers.
So you've written on Hydra, you've been in that place as a creative spirit. I've walked around wondering about, because there was a community, yes, and it was a cheap and relatively simple lifestyle. However, it was, you know, some of those relationships were pretty dramatic, and it was a bit of a hothouse relationship-wise. And I keep wandering around thinking, how was this helpful for them creatively to be in this space together?
In some ways, I think irrelevant. I think, you know, that you know, it depends what you're writing, but in a way, Peel Me a Lotus sort of shows that, you know, that she could go and take a wry look at things and remove herself at that point and go back and write. I think that, you know, if you've got a job to do and a book to write, nothing's going to stop you. And I don't think it's particularly helpful, but I don't think it was unhelpful that there were other people around having crises. I mean, these things do all spark all sorts of other thoughts that make one's own, you know, that feed one's own writing. So maybe it was more productive than just being somewhere that was, you know, entirely a rock with no one else to talk to. I mean, it must have been quite stimulating. In fact, you know, it almost certainly was incredibly stimulating having, you know, so many people wanting to talk about writing and reading, and, you know, and among those people, highly intelligent and stimulating people, as well as people who are there, you know, just sort of wasting their time and posing. But, you know, it must have been great to talk about poetry with, you know, Leonard Cohen or Gregory Corso, or, you know, and then of course there'd be other times when their own problems, you know, I guess, were the exhausting things, and you know, and their own problems with each other. But I think those would have existed wherever they were, because, you know, at the heart of their problem was a medical problem, which was that, you know, George Johnston had to take drugs once his TB was diagnosed. You know, before his TB was diagnosed, he was just terribly ill, and it's very difficult for a woman in her early 30s to live with an invalid. And then, you know, the drugs for his TB made him impotent, and Charmian Clift was a ravishingly beautiful, very vital woman. And, you know, how could she live like a nun? You know, that was going to be a problem wherever they lived. And the other thing about that, of course, was that he had been unfaithful to her in the early days of their marriage. So that sort of somehow exacerbates that problem, because, you know, maybe that could have been something that, you know, they could have lived through. But I think once there's been a betrayal, it would have been very hard for her to have just stayed loyal to him. And of course, he was riven with jealousy and despair. As you know, I totally get that. You know, it was just a horrible situation for both of them. But I'm not sure that the community had that much to do with it. I think it was very much a problem between two people.
Mm. We've talked so far about the realities of the artist colony and Hydra, but actually you've turned this into fiction, and I love the character of Erica and the way that she narrates this story. It was a real spark of genius. Tell us how you came to deciding that she would be the person through whose eyes we would see this story.
Well, I think she's called Erica because actually I thought Eureka the day that she came into my head, because I was at the beginning, I was going to write a different book. It was going to be, I don't know how much people now know the story of what eventually happened, but I mean, sorry, I seem so long-winded. It's very difficult to give short answers. But after this huge hit, which was the book that got them back to Australia, which is an early example of autofiction. I mean, there's, you know, this is, it's a novel, but it's absolutely based in reality. And the next volume was this one. And so they went back to Australia. George Johnston, for most of the, you know, the period that they were back in Australia, was in hospital. Charmian was holding the family together, writing these weekly essays for the Sydney Morning Herald, which she never missed. She never missed a column, which is amazing given everything she was living through. She wrote the screenplay for this. This was already, you know, on the television, and, you know, dealt with all sorts of things, while George, mainly in hospital, wrote this book, which is about their time in Greece. And the problem with this book is it exposes her in a very unflattering light. And by this point in Australia, she was pretty much a household name. And suddenly this book was about to be published. And as I'm sure everyone knows, this event had a very sad outcome. And she didn't live to see its publication, and George died a year later. But my original idea was that I wanted to write her version of this book. And in the unfinished third part of this trilogy, which George died before he'd completed it, sadly, there's this tantalizing view of him, after her suicide, him opening the desk drawer and finding a white leather notebook that he'd had no idea she'd kept during their time in Hydra. Now, it gives me a shiver every time I think about this, because I believe that he was about, I don't know whether the notebook actually existed, but I think it was a device and he was going to give her her own voice. And so I, on reading that book, that incomplete book, wanted to write Charmian Clift's version of Clean Straw for Nothing. But then I found that there's a book by Susan Johnston, anyway, gosh, this is terrible of me not to know, called The Broken Book. And so I was well into starting to write my version of that. And then my husband one day said, oh my goodness, there's this book and it's got Charmian Clift. And I went and I read the blurb on Amazon, and sure enough, there was this other book, at which point I went into total despair. And, you know, just I can't do that. I can't, you know, even though it wasn't the same thing, it was close enough. And so that I had to put my book down for a while. And then I went back to Hydra to sort of wander disconsolately around, really thinking, oh, my book, and having all sorts of other ideas of what I might do with it. And at that, while we were there, Marianne had died a couple of months before, and Leonard Cohen died while we were there. And it was while I was wandering around thinking that was quite strange, and actually thinking, because in my original version, he wasn't going to really speak. He was going to just occasionally walk past and wave, because he doesn't appear in this book. So, you know, so there was no need for him to appear in Charmian's version of this book. But while I was there and sort of wandering around, I suddenly had Erica. And that was, you know, it was this moment of eureka, I need to tell this through the eyes of a very young girl who comes to Hydra to find Charmian. And that was just such an incredible moment, because it gave me back my book and it gave me a way of telling it that was entirely my own. And then, of course, Erica grew into the person that I now think of as someone I know and love.
Before, I would love to hear more about Erica. I really wanted to talk about her character a little bit more, but it was very interesting because I had actually written to myself to ask you I'd heard that you were on Hydra when Leonard Cohen died, and then I reread the prologue to the book, and I thought that must have been the product of your own, like, that was just, I don't know whether you had a beginning, you had nothing, obviously, you didn't have Erica at all, and all of a sudden there she was fully formed.
Yeah. And at that moment, that was in fact, that's what I wrote as soon as I got back to England. That first chapter sort of poured out. She's 76, I think, in that first chapter. And then I had a lot of playing around with, do I write the whole thing from the point of view of her, you know, in her 70s looking back? And then I realized that actually I just wanted her to live and breathe in the moment, because what I really, really wanted to do was, at first I thought she would be sort of a portal, and it would be like that game Fantasy Dinner Party, you know, that you could just put her in the middle of this community and just use her as a sort of shell for the reader to live in, so that the reader was almost there. And so that's what informed the decision to make her 18, was this feeling of, yes, that's the way to make the reader feel it, breathe it, smell it, see it, experience it. And then she just developed. I mean, she, as characters do, you can't just have someone who's a blank canvas. They're always going to develop. But given that she was 18, there wasn't so much for her to do that was going to block the view. She sort of enhanced the view, and she just gave me more and more as I went on.
And being formed by the view.
And be exactly that, and the people she met, and then this idea of being able to look at, you know, women and where we were in that moment between the first wave of feminism and the second wave of feminism, and this sort of wobbly moment before the pill was available, before women could easily seek abortion, you know, this sort of really wobbly moment where there was this sort of social and sexual revolution, but women were still in a really awkward situation. And so it just became more and more fascinating. I mean, I just sort of, all of these things feel like kind of chance ideas, but actually in the end, they gave me exactly what I wanted to write about.
I have a question here from Neil. He says, hello, Polly. Erica was raised in Bayswater, which these days is a rather wealthy suburb. Was the character's mother from money and her father working class? I sensed from the relationship between Erica and her father that this may have been the case. I'd love to know. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, actually, I mean, Charmian and George really did live in Bayswater, and all the time, and as have I for long periods of my life. And I've been walking past their apartment for years. And now, of course, I kind of stop, and I'm so haunted by them. I look up at what I believe are their windows. So Erica's parents, there used to be a lot more about Erica's father and mother in a sort of earlier drafts, but I trimmed them right back. He was a military man, probably not of the same class as her mother. So that's a very interesting observation, yes, that the mother is definitely classier in some way. But I don't think he was, I didn't think of him as particularly working class, actually. I mean, he was just someone, although, you know, we didn't really know about shell shock. It wasn't called shell shock then, but that is what was wrong with him. I mean, you know, there were things I knew about him that, you know, I just had to sort of sprinkle clues. And I think in an earlier version, I probably had put something about him being shell shocked. And I think it was my editor said, I don't think people referred to it then. And so it sort of had to be left as, you know, something was making him like that. But then it was clearly related to the war. Yeah.
I want to go back to what you were saying about Erica sort of observing the lives of women, particularly through observing Charmian's life and also Marianne's life. And I mean, she's sort of drawing her own conclusions about what she wants for herself. But I sensed that that you had that you related personally to each one of those, to Erica, to Marianne, and to Charmian in different ways. And I'd love to hear, you know, how you feel about each of those characters in the book.
Oh, my feelings are so complicated about them all. I mean, they are, you know, I love them and I despair of all of them. And indeed do have, I mean, everyone draws from their own life. And probably the reason that they interested me in the first place was that there were various parallels to my own life. So, you know, I work in a collaborative capacity with my husband. So that interested me, the idea of George and Charmian collaborating. And I suppose that's why I feel this certainty that Charmian really did want to help George with his work. Because, you know, my husband and I take it in turn. So when it's his project, I am his collaborator, probably much in the way that Charmian was with George, in that I am there, I'm sitting there, I'm kind of helping in any way I can, I'm rooting for him, I'm, you know, it's, you know, we're both quite obsessional, so it's all we talk about, and then we listen endlessly to sort of other versions of bits of music or bits of lyric or whatever it is. But it's a very sort of happy collaboration, which, you know, I think that George and Charmian's was at times a very happy collaboration. But ours is, you know, has the advantage of that I'm writing lyrics on the whole and my husband's writing music. I'm not, you know, I'm not trying to write a piece of music with him, and on the whole, he's not writing lyrics with me. I mean, we have written lyrics together. I couldn't collaborate on a novel with anyone. I mean, I cannot imagine how she did that or how he did that. I mean, to write a novel, for me, you have to be in this completely private space which is inside your head, that feels more real than anything that's outside your head. And the idea of someone else even being in the room would be like being hauled out of it, because you can't have a mutual hallucination, which is what, you know, writing can feel like. So yes, so I had that experience of collaborating and of having a lot of children and trying to write. And I did feel that I had a sort of huge amount in common with Charmian, actually. And then with Marianne, I have less in common with her as a personality. but I have had some life experiences that are very similar to her experiences. I mean, her first marriage is very like my first marriage. In that, you know, in fact, there's a sort of really strange thing about her first marriage to Axel Jensen. Axel Jensen, incredibly talented. I mean, he really was something. He was, so when Marianne and Leonard, both 25 on Hydra in 1960, Axel was 30. Axel had written 2 novels by then and a memoir. The memoir was of his time living with nomads in the Sahara Desert in this sort of fantastic, sort of mystical book. The novel was, one of those novels was amazingly successful, made into a film, translated. He was from a sort of, I guess, I don't know whether the term Sloane Ranger means anything to anyone these days, but I interviewed people in Norway who knew him, and they all said this thing, that he came from this rather fast set where they raced yachts and raced cars. And so I always had him in mind as a bit of a Sloane Ranger, you know, in his background. But he was someone who was absolutely committed to his work, and she was totally the woman who made that work possible. You know, his was probably the first desk that she was putting a gardenia and a little sandwich on. And in fact, he, you know, we know from her account that he used to give her his work and get her to put little stars and crosses in the margin. So she was very much sort of involved in the work, and he was clearly a genius. And in a way, karma has served one to him, because he, you know, he was a really, really good writer, but he is remembered mainly as being Marianne's first husband, because he's been eclipsed by her relationship with Leonard. And there is something rather karmic about that, because he treated her so badly. And as we know, you know, she had the baby, and within 6 months he'd run off with another woman. Well, my first marriage was to a sort of, he's sadly now, he died a couple of years ago, but to a poet who, you know, I was very, very young. In fact, I was 26 and, you know, wildly in love. And, you know, we had a baby, and when our baby was 6 months old, off, you know, he was off, because he was absolutely committed to the work, and he sort of had a breakdown. And as Axel had many breakdowns in his life. And I felt that Axel and Heathcote Williams was his name, were very sort of similar in some ways, and so I would dwell on that quite a lot. And then in the sort of, another thing I did in the course of the research was I went to the V&A and I looked at an exhibition called Revolution, and it was this really chilling moment where I looked at this playbill for some poetry readings, a little tour of poetry readings that had been in London in 67, I think it was, and Axel and Heathcote were on the same bill, and it was a really strange moment. So they obviously knew each other, which was really odd. I mean, there were lots of odd things kept happening, actually, while I was writing. I've never had so many strange experiences while I've been writing a book. You know,
and
things.
what about with Erica then? There was parallels with Erica as well, even though she's a fictitious character.
I'm not sure. I mean, of course there must be, because I invented her. And I mean, like Erica, I have no formal education. So in that, we're similar, that, you know, at 18 years old, we are arriving in a place, in my case, it was the world of book publishing. So there's possibly something to that, that I was surrounded by people who were postgraduates on the whole, highly intelligent, you know, in a situation where I was much younger, because I hadn't had a university education. So I was 18, working in those days at Macmillan Press, the academic part of Macmillan, with a lot of people who were very sort of clever and very educated, and who used to sort of spend a lot of time telling me that I ought to go to university, which I sort of found quite kind of, you know, I'd made a decision. And so there was something in that I always found very uncomfortable. So I suppose that has always remained as quite a vivid moment in my life. And that is then, although Erica rather more, you know, it was rather more exciting. I just went to London and got a job. I mean, Erica went to a Greek island. But, you know, I suppose a lot of it was sometimes thinking, well, what would it have been like if I'd done something like that? You know, and also, why didn't I? Well, the answer was I didn't have any money. Whereas Erica, you know, is very, in some ways, quite lucky that she comes into an inheritance just enough to get her to that Greek island and to be able to live for a year or two.
I have to ask you about Leonard Cohen and how you ended up making decisions about including him in the book, because whereas you said before that originally he was just going to go past and kind of wave a little bit in your early renditions of the book, that actually I read somewhere that you actually have used all his own words in dialogue. Yeah. So what was that process, working out how to depict him in the story?
It was a slightly crazy early decision, and then once I'd started, I couldn't stop, because it started to work, which is sort of early on, because I did feel quite hamstrung about putting Leonard Cohen in the book, and I have read other versions of Leonard Cohen, and they don't work because he's so particular, and so I did just start collecting. I kind of thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if he only said things that he had said? And then I thought, well, the things that he sort of, interviews and things that he said after his songwriting career are irrelevant to this, because the thing about Leonard Cohen in this book is that he's a 25-year-old person. He's a 25-year-old writer when he arrives there. He's never traveled outside North America before. He's on a government grant from Canada. He's sort of working on his first novel. He's had one collection of poetry published. We have to forget the Leonard Cohen of later. He's not really that relevant, because it's such a sort of mind-blowing thing to happen to a person to become, you know, famous. And this is pre that fame. And luckily, in those early days, he did publish quite a number of poetry collections, and he did submit quite a number of interviews. So there is actually quite a selection out there. And so I just started pulling it in from every source. Anytime I found a reference to anything, I would go, you know, pull in the interviews. And then it was a matter of going through them and sort of highlighting things that I thought were interesting and that would work conversationally, and then sort of cataloguing them under subjects so that I could draw on them. And then some of them were just so great. Like there's you know, sort of moment when he's talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I knew that I wanted Charmian to be talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, because it had this sort of lovely parallel. So when I came across that in an early interview with Leonard, that was a sort of moment of, oh yes, you know. And then it was about just trying to stay true to those conversations and trying to reframe them in the best way I could, so that I wasn't taking them out of context. But it became a really lovely discipline, because, you know, he was working on his first novel. He also had fantastic work ethic. He was newly in love with Marianne. And so, to my reckoning, in that year, 1960, he wouldn't have been around that much chattering away, because he was quite busy, but, you know, both with Marianne and with writing his first novel, which he cared about very deeply. And so it was great to limit myself. I mean, it got silly. I mean, I found myself unable to have him ask for a cup of coffee, because I didn't actually have him saying in an interview, I'd like a cup of coffee, you know. So I did, you know, it became a slightly ludicrous way of limiting myself, but I decided I would remain true to it. And then it was just it was so pleasing, actually, in the end. It was sort of, I had a sort of gleeful feeling every time he was in a scene, and I could make the dialogue work how I wanted it to work and make it very interactive. You know, if I could get lots of people all chattering away and have him just talking, it was a really, really lovely feeling. It was one of the joys of writing the book, actually. And I think if I'd had him just sort of free to sort of comment all over the place, I'd have just... yeah, it would have been a very different sort of book, and I don't know where the limits would have been. So it actually was, I think, although it was a lot of work, I think it was a good idea.
And the timing of his death kind of changed your sense of how okay it was to depict him in the story as well. It kind of was.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't. It's a terrible word to say it was a relief, but in a kind of like a release, maybe, in the sense that you weren't so like a living artist that you were trying to depict.
Yeah, I mean, there was always. I mean, I didn't know at that point that Leonard Cohen didn't really go to Hydra anymore. I mean, I don't think he'd been there since 1999 or 2000. I mean, it wasn't somewhere you know, he had other fish to fry, I guess. I mean, in fact, somebody interviewed him about it sort of towards, I don't know what year it was, and he said, well, it's just like any other island, and I felt really upset for the island. he obviously, there had been some bad experiences, I think, towards the end of his marriage, and things to do with the house, and you know, and a feeling of casting off. But I didn't know that. So it's a very, very small island, and so had he still been alive, I would have been entirely hamstrung, because of the, you know, you would run into him if he was still going there. You would run into him. In fact, there was this one time when I was in a particularly spooked frame of mind. I think it was when I was writing in George and Charmian's house, and I went to the port for a cup of coffee, and one of my kids had been staying, and my husband was seeing him off on the ferry, so I was on my own, and there was hardly anyone around, and I was drinking my coffee, and then I looked up, and there was Leonard Cohen, and I just thought, oh God, I've now, this is it. I've crossed that sort of barrier. I'm now in my novel. And then I looked again, and it wasn't Leonard Cohen. It was his son, Adam. And I felt, this was only last year. You know, I think I'd finished the book actually at this point, more or less. I was just been doing some final edits, and so I was sort of sitting there thinking, well, this is strange. And then my husband came back from seeing our son off on the ferry. And of course, there's this thing between musicians where they greet each other. And so Adam kind of did a double take and said, David, and came and joined us. And I was sort of sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, this is just, and we then did that Hydra thing of we had a coffee, we had another coffee, you know, we sat, we chatted. And the whole time I was thinking, do I say something? What, you know, do I say something? What do I say? And in the end, I didn't say something, because I just thought it's too strange on first meeting someone to have them say, I've just put your dad in a novel. You know, it's just there's just something too awkward about that. So I guess it would have been a whole lot worse if that had been the dad and not the son. So yeah,
you must tell him eventually.
What?
Did you
I
tell
will
him
tell him.
eventually?
Oh yeah, I mean, I should send him a copy of the book. I just haven't quite worked up the courage yet. I mean, I wouldn't want to read about my dad in someone else's book. Really, I don't think.
Well, I mean, there's been so much written about him, I guess. In the end, you only want to remember the person that you knew.
Yeah. I mean, it remains to be seen.
You've said that you've written a lot of the book on Hydra, and it's very evocative the way you talk about the seasons. So we get a very strong sense of what, you know, the changing seasons throughout the year that we follow the story. And I wondered how much time you spent on Hydra, and, you know, what the discipline was around writing on Hydra. Did you only go there to write?
No, I really went there to, so I do this thing called method writing. And so, I mean, I did write on Hydra, but the thing I did more than write was I wandered around being, this sounds so crazy, being my characters and trying to see it through their eyes and having their experiences as much as I possibly could. And I was again really blessed. I mean, things happened. I went there a lot. I went there, I've probably been, in fact, I've been in every month of the year. We spent Christmas there. That was our first December there, just gone. It seems amazing that I was there 2.5 months ago. I mean, it feels like 5 years ago now. But there would be things like, for example, in the book, there's a scene where Charmian wants to go and take part in this pagan May Day ritual where they climb the highest peak, which is amazingly called Mount Eros, and wait for the sunrise. And I'd already written this chapter, and it's her and Leonard Cohen and Erica, of course, and 1 or 2 other people do this climb. And I was then in Hydra and sort of thought, oh, I've written it, but what if it's all wrong, you know? So my husband and I, and actually our in Bar, who's also a writer, was staying with us. And so we did do that thing of getting up at 4 a.m, climbing this mountain, getting to the top, sort of sitting and waiting for that sunrise. And I mean, it was spectacular. But actually the best thing about it was exactly how I'd written it. It was so wonderful. But other sort of things would happen. Like there was one time we were there and it hadn't happened for years, but there was a total power outage. And for, I can't remember how long it was, but it was days. There was no electricity. And of course, in the time I've been writing about, there was very limited electricity. And again, that felt like a gift, because I was now on the island as it would have been, because of course all the tourists scarpered because there were no flushing loos or anything. I mean, it was, you know, for anyone, you know, who kind of had, you know, something that they wanted to do, it was terrible. For me, it was the best thing you can imagine, looking out over the entirely black island at night with just the bright stars, and sort of being able to really see it how it would have been. And yeah, and another time we were there, and there really was a sort of north wind that made it impossible to get off the island for days. And of course, there's a scene in the book where nothing can come, and the ferry can't come, and the mail can't come because of this wind. And so yeah, so the things I needed kept being presented to me. I mean, the island is very generous like that.
So you didn't need, it was more to have the experience of doing your method writing when you were on Hydra, and then you'd go home and write? Yeah,
I mean, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, most of it was written in a shed in my garden, because it's the only place, because you have to get away from the internet. You have a perfectly lovely, you know, room you could sit at with a desk and all mod cons, but no, I go and sit in a shed. But that is because nobody knows I'm there. Nobody thinks to go and look in the shed. And so most of it was written in the shed, but quite a bit was written on Hydra as well. But while I was on Hydra, it felt that the best use of my time was to sort of absorb and not just sit writing.
Mm. How much do you think the absorption of Greek culture infiltrated the artists and their work?
Of that community, they lived very separately. I mean, nobody spoke English. So they really did just live with each other. I mean, they you know, it was like a Greek chorus all around them, the sort of taverna owners and the fishermen and all of those things. But I don't think there was a huge amount of cross-pollination because there was a language problem. I mean, now everyone speaks English, but then they really didn't. So difficult to cross-pollinate, I think.
I read somewhere that Leonard Cohen had a set of worry beads that he adopted as a you know,
oh yeah, yeah, convolute beads, yeah. I mean, he genuinely did have them till the end. I mean, he had them till the end. He flicked them like a local, yeah. So I mean, I have some in my writing shed actually for the. I mean, I do. I mean, I don't want to sort of give away exactly how crazy I am, but you know, I have a string of convolute beads that are like Leonard's, and when I'm doing Leonard, you know, I've got them in my hand when I'm writing Leonard. And Damien, in fact, who I just mentioned, Damien Barr. I mean, I do some quite crazy things when I'm writing. So, I think it's in one of her essays, Charmian refers to Magrif, the scent.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, well, it's going to be really helpful to have Charmian's favourite scent when I'm writing Charmian. So I bought myself a bottle of Magrif, and it smelled like a toilet. I mean, it was horrible. I mean, I don't know if anyone's smelt this horrible perfume. And so I said to Damien, oh no, this is awful. Surely she didn't smell like this. And Damien, because he's an extraordinary person, knew someone who was some sort of expert in scent, and who had a library of scents. And what it was that Magrif in the 60s was a very different smell. They changed the formulation. And this friend of Damien's had the original formulation, and Damien got a tiny little phial of this, you know, Magrif, which would have been the Magrif that Charmian would have, and of course it was delicious. And so I kind of had that, I have that in my shed. And if I was really sort of in a Charmian bit, I just kind of have while I'm sitting writing, have a little sniff. And those sorts of things they do stimulate.
And it doesn't sound mad to me at all. It sounds perfectly logical, to be honest. Yeah, but you would try to inhabit. I mean, I can kind of relate to that in terms of the way I think about a person that I'm going to be talking to about their work. Is I wonder about them. I walk around wondering about them, even when I'm not actually physically sitting doing work. And I'm sure that's the same experience. They never really leave you if you're working on a piece.
No, they became. I mean, the closest is to think of them like imaginary friends. I think that they're just there and they chatter away. I mean, but the problem with talking about it is I always do think I sound quite crazy. Exactly. If you knew the extent to which they chatter away, and and you do, I suppose the reason it's quite good to have a break and do songwriting in between writing novels, which is that towards the end of writing a novel, I think I am actually sort of much more in the world of my novel than I am in the world of my family. And they're used to me now, but they have to say they can talk to me, and I can see my family, and their lips are moving, and they know that I can't hear them, and it always ends up with me saying, sorry, can you just run that by me again? And then again, suddenly, the world of my novel is stronger and I can't hear them. It's very strange.
So I guess the other element of that we haven't really talked about is about the people who were able to shed some light on this story. Yeah. And I'd love to spend the last few minutes just asking you about who you use most as a resource, and how
many people.
There's so much written, and so many people who are connected still to the story.
Yeah, well, I have to say that there were, on Hydra, wonderful. I was like a mad gerontophile. Anytime I saw someone who's quite old, I just sort of go and make friends with them, because and try and slip in. Did you know Charmian and George? And actually, I do now have friends on Hydra who did indeed know Charmian and George. There's a wonderful painter who's a dear friend now called Bill Pownall, who arrived in '63 and spent Christmas with them, and he is one of the few, because actually the other people who've been there a long time arrived annoyingly in '65, but then there are other people who were children and knew them and were very, very, always very, very fond of them. You got a lovely picture of them from a lot of the children, and it was a lot of the children that I talked to the most. So I talked to children of most of the people in the novel, actually, and they were all really, really helpful and really generous. And a lot of that at the beginning was because I was steeped in everything I could read, but I really did need to know things, really funny details, like where was the slaughterhouse, or in those days, or how did you get milk? Or, I think it was Goran Tonström's son, Linus, who, Facebook is an incredible thing, isn't it? I connected with him, found we had a friend in common. And he was wonderfully helpful. And, we used to refer to it as me trying to find out about the milk and the kerosene, because it was, it's a lot of those sorts of details that I needed. Because and another person, a woman called Fani Exidis, who is Greek and who was a child in those days, but she was wonderful. Just, it's funny little details, like her talking about carrying the ice up the steps from the ice factory, or the man who left the ice, and you squirrel away all those little details. Or one of the amazing things was that whenever you read about George and Charmian, in every biography, every book about them, you come across this reference to someone called Didi Cameron. And the reason that you come across this reference is that in 1960, towards the end of the year, they left Hydra for a period, for almost a year, and they did a house swap. And it's only ever written that they did it with someone called Didi Cameron. Well, you can Google Didi Cameron, or back then, all you like, and you can't find anything. And I was rather despairing of this. I found one reference to her in a biography of Elizabeth Jane Howard, but nothing about her, didn't know who she was. And one day I was with another friend of mine who's a writer, and she said, how's the book going? And I said, well, it's all fine, except I'm so frustrated because there's this character called Didi Cameron and I can't find out anything about her. And she said, oh, she was my therapist. Sorry. She said, oh yes, she's great. She, unfortunately she's dead now, but I can put you in touch with her daughter. So then I was in touch with her daughter, her son, and then her granddaughter, who has her house now on Hydra, who went through all the photo albums for me and got her brother, who'd actually stayed with George and Charmian in England, to write me an account of everything. And they were so, the children, and in this case, the grandchild of everyone in my book, they were all so incredibly generous, including actually latterly Jason Johnston, George and Charmian's son, who has been so gracious and generous about this book. And I spent some time with him. I'd already finished the book, thank goodness, otherwise he'd have been so tired of my questions. But it was done by the point really that I met him. But even so, he was incredibly generous and gave me one or two lovely things that are in the book. And you know. So yeah, I think the children of the people, of the real characters, just so nice about it, actually, and generous.
Polly, if I hadn't already thoroughly enjoyed this book, I would be desperate to read it, having listened to you talk about it tonight. I really would be, because your enthusiasm is so infectious. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been such a pleasure hearing you talk about it.
Oh, it's been lovely talking about it. I'm still obsessed with them all, really, to be honest. I don't know how I'm ever going to get them to leave me alone.
Maybe there's another book. Maybe there's more.
Oh, I wish.
Thank you again so much. And I also want to thank Jane Seaton from Beaufort Street Books for organising this event, and just to encourage the people who've joined us tonight again to go to their local bookstore. That's really what we want to do. Wherever you are in the world, support your local bookstore. That's what we're all about. And just before we go this evening, and I have warned Polly about this bit, so the next thing that I need to tell you is that next week is the 10th anniversary of Beaufort Street Books, and that you've got to keep an eye out, because there's going to be a celebration. There's going to be a big morning tea on the 24th of June, 10 a.m. Perth time, and there are going to be 3 cookbook authors who will, they're mystery cookbook authors at the moment, but they're guaranteed to be great ones. All proceeds will go to the Cancer Council, as the biggest morning tea does raise money for the Cancer Council. And just so wherever you are, either in the bookstore or online, that there is 10% off all cookbooks for June, including new ones pre-ordered. Polly Samson, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much to you and Jane and Beaufort Books. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good evening.